call it a rug. I call this one a ride.
Really
I
wrong.
call this an air fryer.
One.
I call this a shorty thing.
Thanks.
I call this one the Southern Border Christ. I call it cyanide. I call this a bug's life. Rhyme.
That's
And
enough.
I call this a... I call it curb stomping. I call this getting mugged. And I call this an A10 warthog. I call this one a slip and slide. I call it a good dad. I call it Pete. And I call this one rhymes with Grugs. Styles. I call it April 12, 2036. I call this a pixie stick. And I call this one Crude Stew. And I call this Battlefront 3. I call this a thug. This one crippling depression. I call this a Part 49 lead. I call this one... I call it Xbox. I call this a hospital visit. I call it a pub. A Switch 2. And I call this one rhymes with Grugs too. I call these younglings. Slug. I call it dementia. I call this a job application. I call it dementia. And I call this an ender pearl. I call this Afghanistan. I call it dementia. Moonwalk. I call this a peanut allergy. I call this cheating death. I call this a mug. I call this hair loss. I call it foreshadowing. No. I call it arson. I call this one rhymes with Grug 3. I call this therapy.
So how have you been feeling since our last...
I call this the entire Crudes movie. Dementia. This one, a grug. I call this a chug jug. And I call this a shameless plug. Rhymes.com president. I call it the atomic. I call these stairs. I call this aura farming. I call this one rhymes with Grug 4. I call this one the bite of 87. And I call this one tax evasion. I call this a loser. And I call this one being scared of women. Rhymes with... And I call this ASMR. And I call this one a lifterator. And I call this one Lego. I call it dementia. This one the client. I call this one the high ground. I call this one a hug. I call it a chiropractor.